This is on yours, it's not.
Maybe it should be like that. All right. Welcome to the last session of the day. We're going to continue the discussion from the previous session and talk about the links between pensions and development. This morning, Annika reminded us of that pensions is really not the end game. It's just a step on the way to development. And we're going to continue that discussion here with 4 distinguished guests. We have Ari Cocoa, who is a professor at the Department of International Economics at the Copenhagen Business School. We have Olli Kangas from Finland, from the Social Security Institution, where you're professor and research director. We have Joel Mendizabal from Bolivia. You're a research analyst at the Department of Analysis and Social Economic Policies. And finally, we have Charles Knox-Vydmanov from HelpAge International, where you work as a policy advisor. And you're going to talk about, you also worked on something called the Pension Watch, which you will, I think you will talk on. We will start with each of the participants giving a short presentation. And after that, we'll have a discussion. I will ask the participants to comment on each other's presentations, and then I will give the floor to you for questions. So, Charles, you're going to start.
One second. Okay, gone too far. Okay, so yeah, well, I'm just going to try and make a very brief presentation about just giving really a kind of brief survey of the expansion of social protections, particularly over the last 2 decades. So this is going to reflect to some extent some of the discussion in the previous session, but with a bit more of a focus on a specific tool, on a specific area of pensions. So just to say, pretty much everything that this presentation is based on 2 main kind of pieces of work and sources. One of them is what we call our social pensions database, which HelpAge has developed over the last 3 to 4 years, which we host on our Pension Watch site, and there's lots of resources and materials out there for you to look at it if you're more interested. But essentially it's a database of the 100+ social pensions that exist in the whole world, with kind of some detailed description of parameters, benefit levels, coverage, etc., etc. The second kind of piece of work this is based on, that's why I've referenced Robert Palacios from the World Bank there, is that just over the last few months, and we actually submitted a paper yesterday to a journal, we've been doing a bit of analysis on that data and really trying to kind of pull out some of the trends, which some of this presentation is based on. So I thought to start with, it's good that we're all on the same page in terms of what a social pension is, because a lot of the time the term is used in a way that doesn't quite reflect how it's normally defined. But the way that the likes of HelpAge, the World Bank, many other organizations define social pensions is as state-provided, non-contributory, regular cash transfers to older people. And really the kind of core defining feature of a social pension in terms of pensions is its non-contributory nature. And the term is often used synonymously with non-contributory pension. Beyond this fairly broad definition, there are many different kind of ways in which a social pension can be designed. The age of eligibility, the benefit level, and perhaps most kind of contentiously, the targeting criteria vary massively from country to country. So what does the history of social pensions look like? Now what this chart shows is it plots the year of introduction of every social pension that we have data for with income per capita. Income per capita used here just to kind of divide the countries a little bit, so you wouldn't be able to see it otherwise. So every dot plots this year of introduction. And so as what we see is, as has been reflected in some of the discussion already, social pensions have quite a long history and were really part of some of the initial explorations and kind of reforms and the birth of kind of modern social security towards the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. People often look back to the law of Otto von Bismarck, the first pension law in 1889 as the birth of modern social security, but actually Iceland and Denmark and a few years later New Zealand were already following with very different models of social security a little bit later, non-contributory pensions. That said, over the next century really, the predominant model of social security around the world has been of contributory social security, especially in terms of the pension system. If you look at the majority of countries around the world, almost every country has some kind of contributory pension. And many of these were implemented with some kind of the similar intentions and objectives that Germany and many other European countries had when they implemented their contributory social insurance schemes that later went on to cover the majority of the population. The idea was that a large proportion of the population, most people would be able to contribute to this system, and then through elements of solidarity, redistribution, some level of subsidy throughout that system, everybody would be able to depend on a basic minimum pension in old age. What we really see, though, in the experience of many developing countries was that issues of informality and poverty meant that the vast majority of people weren't even able to make those basic contributions. So really, it's only actually in the last 20 years or so that you start to see social pensions really re-emerge and as a kind of predominant tool within pension systems within the wider social protection system. As you see, this kind of congregation of countries really since 1990 implementing social pensions gives a picture of that. And just to put those numbers in perspective, there are around 100 social pensions in the world. 101, I think, is the number we have now. And 50 of them, so half, were implemented and introduced since 1990, and 30 since the year 2000. So this is really the kind of expansion in these types of programs has happened mainly over the last 2 decades. One thing we can do with having the income per capita plotted up on the vertical axis is to actually look at what kind of income groups, according to the World Bank's income classification, these countries fell into when they introduced social pensions. And you see some quite interesting trends here. While this group that has introduced social pensions in the last couple of decades are spread right across the kind of GDP per capita income spectrum, quite a substantial number are in the lower middle income bracket, so relatively poor countries. And there are also a few that fall into the low-income country bracket. In hindsight, I also think actually the low-income line should be slightly higher, but I think there's an issue with the particular measure I've used of PPP dollars. But as you see, this is something that developing countries are introducing and is therefore seemingly of relevance to their vision of development. But those dots on a chart are perhaps a little bit abstract, so I thought I'd try and give you a few more concrete examples. This is a map that shows all the countries in the world that have some form of social pension. Those coloured in red are those with a social pension, those coloured in grey are those without. The darker red, which you might be able to pick out, are those which we've kind of defined as high coverage social pensions. That is, they cover the majority of older people, whereas those in a lighter colour cover generally the minority of older people. It's a pretty crude division. But just to give you a flavour of some of the significant reforms that have really happened over the last 2 decades. Well, I think if you look globally, perhaps the most kind of dramatic change in the landscape in terms of pensions, really around social pensions, has been in Latin America. Again, in 1990, these were fairly rare and small throughout the region. Since then, virtually every single country that didn't have a social pension has introduced one, and many at significant scale. Countries like Ecuador have gone from zero coverage of social pensions and very low coverage of the pension system as a whole to the social pension covering around 60–70% of people. And that's happened since 2003, so some real rapid changes. And we'll hear about Bolivia in a second that's done something similar. And I think if you're looking for the winner in terms of expansion of pension coverage in recent history and probably in world history, it would be China since the year 2009. Since 2009, China's been expanding a rural social pension system, which isn't quite strictly a social pension in that it has the condition that you only get this pension on the condition that your children are also contributing to this system for their own pension in the future. But essentially, for most of today's older people, it provides a basic social pension. Now, since 2009, 130 million older people over 60 have started receiving that social pension. And if you look at that, relative to the population over 60 in China, that's 70%, and 16% of the total global population of people over 60. So quite a significant impact on the Chinese older people and the world's older people in terms of absolute numbers. So really, I'm mainly going to leave it there, but the kind of final point I really just kind of wanted to end with was that, how do I want to phrase it? Yeah. This is just one social protection tool we're looking at here. Social pensions are just one way of dealing with the pension system, and they are only an old age, and pensions is just one area of a wider social protection system. That said, what has kind of emerged for us at HelpAge over the last couple of years is that countries like these here do seem to be investing a significant proportion of their government expenditure in these kind of programs and making significant investment. And social pensions and pensions more generally seem to stand out as something quite distinct within a social protection system. Examples include that pensions often have historically been one of the starting points of social protection systems. They tend to remain substantial within the system in terms of expenditure, and that's same for developing countries and more developed alike. Another interesting thing with the development of these social pensions around the world is, unlike many social protection schemes, they're all funded by government. Many of them have a legal basis, which is rare for a lot of social protection programs. And they tend to have a long-term vision. Many social protection programs are implemented on a kind of programmatic project basis with kind of indefinite time frame. Pensions are usually seen as something that will exist into the future. Now, all I'd say is, when we've thought of that, the importance that governments and countries seem to see in social protection in old age, it seems hard to justify that alone by a concern for a particular group of the population. And what's increasingly striking us from the various evidence we're seeing of the impact of pensions and the impact of there not being any pensions in place in a country is that actually this is going to a much deeper concern about, I think, as Michael was pointing towards in the last session, insecurity throughout the life course and the impact of what it means to look to an old age without a secure income and how that might affect people's decisions and the kind of intergenerational relationships of people with older people. I'll leave it at that because I think some of the further presentations might touch on those issues. But yeah, thank you very much.
Olli?
Thank you very much. Is it working? Yes, I suppose so. My presentation deals with pensions and development, and it's a kind of reflection what Annika said in his presentation in the morning. And I go through some ideas that we had together with Joachim Palmer when we wrote the Nordic contribution to Annika's project. And we wrote about pensions and development, and I say something about it. And the main tasks of pensions, of course, they are to eliminate old age poverty. And that's the main, let's say, the core. And that's the least common denominator that all political parties can agree upon. And then it's a little bit more controversial what will happen with the guarantee or standard of living during old age. Should we have that kind of statutory system or not? In very many countries we do have statutory or legislated pensions that are related to earnings or income. But what I'm emphasizing in my presentation is that social policy and pension policies, they are much more than taking money from one pocket and putting it into another pocket. because social policy divides people, social policy unifies people, and social policy creates possibilities for development and enhance social capital. And both monetary capital and social capital are very important preconditions for development. And let's begin. When we here in the Nordic countries started with our pensions, the countries were very poor, as was emphasized this morning. And what was specific for, especially for Sweden and Finland, was that those first national pensions, they were fund-based, they were contributory, and they collected funds. And what was very interesting to my mind from the developmental perspective was that in that age when those pension schemes were introduced in Sweden, okay, it's wrong there, it's 1913 in Sweden, in Finland and Norway a little bit later, but anyway, those countries were very poor. And people were mostly living in agrarian economy. And very often they were outside monetary economy. And the question was how on earth it was possible in such circumstances to collect and raise insurance fees or collect money. Anyway, they managed, and I'll say a little bit more about it a little bit later on, and then income-related pensions were introduced in Sweden in the late 50s, and in Finland in early 60s, and in Norway in the middle 60s, and Denmark never. And in Denmark they have private collective insurance policies that take care of income-related pensions. As I said in the very beginning, the Nordic countries were poor, and we took very small steps. We had the funded scheme, and then there were means-tested supplements, as presented and shown by Joachim Palme. And the question was, how is it possible to collect insurance contributions from people who were living in subsistence economy outside monetary economy? And to some extent, it's parallel to those situations that we have in developing economies, but only to some extent, because in the Nordic countries, people were lacking money, whereas in very many cases, let's say, for example, in South Korea, there are huge sectors that are living in informal sector, but they are not without money, as people used to be in the Scandinavian countries. But the story or the morality of the Nordic story is that those funded schemes that were built up, they were used up to constructing nation. And for example, in the Finnish case, national pension funds were used up to build up electric networks in the country, so that more than 70% of electric power stations were built up on the basis and by the help of national pension funds. And also after the Second World War, those national pension funds were used up to rebuild the country and to help the country to recover after those war damages. And income-related pensions were both in Sweden and in Finland combination of pay-as-you-go and funding systems. And also those funds were used, to my mind, very cleverly. In Finland, they were used up to build up national infrastructure or national industry, so that the investments went into national investments in national industrial projects. Whereas here in this country, they built up 1 million new flats that helped people to move from countryside to the southern part of the country, to Stockholm, Gothenburg, etc., and there were houses and flats available for those people who were moving from rural areas to industrial areas. So that the funds were built up as to build up national infrastructure. But the funds also were used, and the pensions were used to build up a nationhood. And very name nation pension or national pension or people's pension tell very much what it was about. And in the Scandinavian countries, we very often refer that we have a national insurance, not only pensions, but very many other insurance forms are national insurances. And also we have people's school, so that there was a hidden agenda behind building up those schemes that, okay, we are building up a nation here. And also in a similar way, we used pension funds to build up national infrastructure. Okay, then we used small steps, and very often we forget it when we tell stories. Usually we depict the Nordic countries like this, that we show how marvelous results we have received here in the Northern Hemisphere. And very often then people from other countries say that we have no possibilities whatsoever to build up that kind of scheme. And also the Northerners contribute to that kind of thinking by saying that, okay, we are pretty good. But in some sense, there is lots to do. For example, if you look relative poverty rates among the elderly people in Europe, we see that on average poverty levels are pretty low or lower in the Nordic hemisphere, especially very low in Sweden in comparison to the other OECD countries and in comparison to other European countries. But there are some problems with income among those very old people, so that the Nordic countries are not anymore doing that well. Sweden is doing better than Denmark, that's doing better than Finland, but in comparison to many other European countries, we are not that good anymore as we are among those a little bit younger pensioners. And then there were some questions raised in a previous section that there is no gender dimension here. And if you look poverty rates among male and female pensioners, we see that also in the Nordic countries there's a discrepancy between males and females, so that the poverty rates and the incidence of poverty among elderly women are much higher than among elderly males. And there's something that must be done something. And for example, in my country, in Finland, we have a pension committee just now sitting and making its recommendations, and there's a big issue dealing with discrepancy between female and male pensioners. And also, it seems to be so that in the Nordic countries, being a single person living alone is perhaps at least as big a risk as in many other European countries, whereas people living in couples or pensioners living in couples, they are very well protected. And that's one point. And then one point is to then look at the pension schemes and to ask people if they trust in social security and if they trust in their pensions. And this has something to do with social capital. And usually here in the Nordic hemisphere we have a great deal of trust on other people, and we have a great deal of trust on our institutions, as displayed in this figure. On the y-axis, we have the percentage of those people who say that it's not possible to have this pension level in 10 years' time from now. And as can be seen, for example, if you look at Germany, there's majority of Germans who think that we don't have possibilities to have this kind of pension system as we have now. Whereas in the Nordic countries, the majority of people, they believe in the systems. It may be so that the Northerners are a little bit simple-minded and they don't know what's going to come. But anyway, I think that this is indicative in that the systems that we have built up, they have created a great deal of social capital. And to sum up, we have done piecemeal reforms here, and we will do piecemeal reforms. The model that we developed 100 years ago, or 50 years ago, or 15 years ago, those models, they were not ready-made. But they are under constant construction. And it means that we are constantly reacting and reforming the schemes. Despite the fact that when Sweden introduced the new pension system in the late 90s, the Minister of Social Affairs said that, okay, we have constructed now something that will last up to the next ice age. But 2 years ago, or 1.5 years ago, I read in Dagens Nyheter that there was an article by astrophysicer from Lund University who said that the next ice age will be sooner than we have anticipated. And it means that also the Swedes have to reform their systems.
Thank you. Ari?
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Ari Cocoa. I'm going to say a few words or make a few reflections about pensions and development on the basis of 2 strands of work that I've been involved in over the past 20-odd years. One is related to the economic and social history of the Nordic countries, the kinds of issues we talk about today with reference to the 100th anniversary of the Swedish pension system. The other line of work is work that I've done in Vietnam since the early 1990s, focusing on development for the last 8 years in a very informal sense as a member of an advisory team to the Vietnamese Minister of Agriculture and Rural Development. And in that function, I've been pushing very hard for the introduction of a social pension scheme for a group that has been left out of much of Vietnamese development over the past decades, namely farmers. There are pension schemes in Vietnam, of course, but they are to workers in the formal industrial sector and to government employees. And the keywords that I would like to bring out in this very short introduction are mainly 3. 1 is recognition, 2 is economic impact, and 3 is cost. Maybe it's a little bit strange that I, as a die-hard neoclassical economist, would start with something that is not economics, but I think recognition is really important. And what I mean here is that when we look at many developing countries, and in particular those countries that are moving now up the scale of increasing GDP per capita, reaching development, what we see is that this development, to a very large extent, is carried by farmers and low-skilled workers. These are groups that are very, very seldom recognized in any public policies. They are carrying the burden, but they are reaping very few of the fruits of development. And I think an introduction of a social pension system, a social pension scheme, would be one of very few ways to recognize their contribution. Now, this is an argument at the macro level, And it's an argument that resonates fairly well with parts of the Vietnamese leadership. But it is also an argument that we can take down to the micro level and to the level of households. In Vietnam, as in many other developing countries, or in the Nordic region 100 years ago, a sad truth is that elderly are often considered as a financial burden for the household. We talk about dependency ratios. Now, a pension could potentially be very important in changing their status and bringing recognition also at this very micro household level, because they add to the household's monetary income and hence allow the old people to continue contributing to development. And this is really an economic argument, and if we look more at the economics of it, what perhaps should be stressed a little bit more than what we've done, it's been up for discussion during the past presentations, is really that even small pensions matter. The first Swedish pension that we discussed this morning and that we continue discussing wasn't large. It was less than 10% of the average income of urban workers. But it did have a substantial impact for many, many households because they were agrarian, largely agrarian, rural households. They were very poor, and in particular, they had a high degree of self-sufficiency. Their monetary income was not very small. So even this very, very small pension, at 10% of the wages of urban workers, amounted to a pretty big share of the household's total monetary income. It did have substantial economic impact in that sense. If we look at what pensions are used for, we also see that it is an addition to household income that is very often not consumed. Going into records, historical records for what happened in Sweden and Finland in the early parts of the 20th century, looking at what is happening now in countries in East Asia, China and Vietnam, where experiments are carried out, we see that pension income goes to investment. It goes to school books for grandchildren. It goes for various kinds of very cheap but still capital goods that are used to improve the household's productivity and living standard. There's a great difference between how the incomes of old people are used and how additional incomes earned by young or younger, in particular men, are used. If younger men get additional income, beer consumption tends to go up very heavily. Then we should also perhaps note that lack of social security and pensions tends to cause various kinds of economic distortions. A pension system is good because it generates savings that can be used for socially important projects, as Olli said. But a lack of pensions could also lead to excessive savings. This is what the Chinese are struggling with now. And in the current Chinese 5-year plan, pensions form an important component of the ambitions to increase domestic demand. People are simply saving too much because they have to set aside money for their old age. They have to fund, to some extent, the schooling of their children, and the healthcare coverage is such that you need to have extra funding if something were to happen. Now, in each of these areas, there are programs underway to resolve these issues. In the Vietnamese case, we see another kind of distortion that really is very troublesome, and that is the dysfunctional land market in rural areas. Because older farmers have no other means of income or sustenance, they hold on to their land. They hold on to their land until they die. And this is quite problematic in a society where the potential of increasing agricultural productivity and agricultural production to some extent is related to the ability to increase farm size so that more modern methods of farming can be introduced, so that higher quality of farm products can be produced. A pension system could potentially influence this to some extent. Incidentally, this is the only argument that really gets the Vietnamese ministry excited. An efficiency argument. Now, regarding costs, many people have already said that the response to the introduction of social pensions, and especially universal systems, is very often that, yeah, this could be okay for rich countries, but a poor country can't afford it. It is important, again and again, to stress the fact that pension systems and social security systems in general develop gradually, and the first steps can be tailored to resources. Everything is a variable. There is a variable in deciding at what age the first system is going to start. You heard in the morning that the first Swedish system started for people aged 67 at a time when expected length of life was 50-something. Now, 70 could be a suitable age in the Vietnamese case. The first Swedish pension amounted to 10% of urban incomes. Okay, we do something like that in Vietnam. What are we talking about? We're talking about a cost of 0.5% of GDP for the transfer itself. And this is really small. What kinds of references could we have? Well, Vietnam Airlines is going to buy between 20 and 50 large passenger airplanes, Airbuses and Boeing planes, that cost each of them about half of the annual cost of a pension system. I didn't want to put it on the chart here, but the Vietnamese spend about 6 to 7 billion US dollars a year on alcoholic beverages and tobacco. That's 10 times more than the annual cost of something like that. Of course, Vietnam can afford it. Of course, many other developing countries can afford it. It's mainly a matter of priorities and political will. Thank you.
Thank you, Ari. Joel?
Okay. Thank you for the invitation to the Church of Sweden and HelpAge International. Today I'm going to present some results of the Dignity Pension, or the Renta Dignidad, how is it called in Spanish, which is the social pension program we have implemented since 5 years ago. This pension is actually a universal non-contributory transfer given to people older than 60 years. And by 2012, more than 30,000 people received the pension. The coverage is actually around 91% of the whole older people population. The amount which is given to these people is around 20% of the minimum wage, but we have a differentiation on the amount, because people who has a pension from the contributory system receive only 75% of the amount. This pension is financed by the taxes, as almost more of these social transfers, but in the Bolivian case, the taxes are coming from the hydrocarbon production, and the annual cost of this program is around 1% of the GDP. And as Ari was saying before, Bolivia is a poor country, and actually we are affording this program successfully so far. Does the pension provide a successful outcome? That was the question we were raising in Bolivia like 2 years ago, and we made a special survey around the whole country, and we used an econometric technique called regression discontinuity design, which basically compares households with people close to the age of eligibility, that means close to the age of 60 years old, with households who has people that were receiving the pension. And the impact we found was that the standards of living of the population and the household who receives the program was increased when they start to receive the pension. How we measure this is we can see the increase on the per capita income of around 16%, and also in per capita consumption, the increase is similar, around 15.4%. But more interesting is the findings regarding the poverty rate reduction. And we can see that using the same measures as the National Institute of Statistics of Bolivia over the poverty line, we can see that the reduction of poverty rate at the household level is quite amazing. 13.5 percentage points, that means from a rate of 53%, we are decreasing poverty among these households. But Bolivia also, in this case, we had an additional result which was based on the self-perception of this household. And using this indicator, the reduction we can see that is more than the poverty line. And this measure can tell us that the reduction on poverty rate is 16 percentage points. These results are published in a report that was socialized recently by the government around over the country, but we are still working, finding more results on the impact of this program. And recently we find out that not only the per capita income or consumption and the poverty rate were the result of this program. We found that children on the age of 10 to 16 years old, they are not working anymore. The reduction on child labor is around 8.4 percentage points that when they start receiving the pension, I mean when the older people start receiving the pension in the household, and this result is similar with the rate of increasing the school enrollment by 8 percentage points. So we conclude that the impact of this program is not only on reducing the child labor in this household, but also in incentives to go more often to school. And so this is our additional results we have found on other members in the households which are beneficiaries of the program. So what conclusions do we have so far is that Bolivia has now evidence about the success of the program and how it is going to increase on the standards of living and poverty reduction in Bolivia. But this is not only around the elderly population, but it's also some impact that is given to all other members of the household. In Bolivia, most of the older people, more than 80% of older people, live with extended family members. I mean, live with all relatives, and that's why we use this impact to analyze the households, not only the older members. But we also found some problems because in rural areas we have more people that are poor. But the impact that we have found is that it's significant more in urban areas rather than rural. So we need to keep analyzing what's going on, because it seems that the pension as a cash transfer is not working so well in rural areas, but it's working more in the urban areas. So that's a challenge we still have in Bolivia to find out what's going on there. And like this program has shown sustainability because the fund which is receiving the incomes each year actually has a balance that can support more than 2 years of payment if we don't receive any more incomes. So, but we don't have some facts about the efficiency of the program. So we need to keep looking to analyze if the cost is good for the country, or we need to start looking for some other ideas like focalizing, or for targeting. So, but with these results, even that they seem to be very successful, we cannot conclude if targeting will be a good idea for Bolivia. In my opinion, we need to, the recommendation will be to keep improving the program and keep implementing, because there is no reason to drop all this program, because the results that I have shown today are very important, and that's what I wanted to share with you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for interesting presentation. It's clear that social pensions are growing and that they have an impact not only for the old but for the household as a whole, and that they contribute to poverty alleviation, but also maybe as a building block for continue developing social protection, like the development in the Nordic countries. Before we turn to the audience, just your short reflection, how do you think we can promote continued expansion of social pensions? Charles showed us that there's been a great expansion in the last 20 years, but how can that continue, and what do you think are the main obstacles? You can start, Joel.
In countries like Bolivia or other developing countries where they have implemented social pensions, the main obstacles are that we don't have a basis on research, that even that research were published like from several researchers, but government doesn't apply that knowledge, and they do the policies without that basis. So they implement pensions or other programs without the basis on the academic conclusions we have so far in different countries.
Mm-hmm. So we have to be better at using our research and results to implement programs that work.
Yeah, Bolivia had that problem, because the government implemented the pension without knowing if it will be successful or not. So it was just political decision, and I guess more of the countries do that.
Olli?
I very much like it, the way Ari ended up his presentation, said that it's question of priorities, and who do those prioritizing, who prioritize its political decision making. And then this leads to question of democracy. And there were some reflections in those earlier sessions that said that we should give voice to people. And you, Ari, said that in some countries that you are familiar with, farmers and low-skilled workers, they don't have to say. And when it comes to the Nordic hemisphere, the interesting thing is that in the very early phases, we had representation from agrarian population. Already in the House of Estates, there was a special estate farmers. And then when they began to plan first workers' insurance schemes like Bismarckian model, then the agrarians came out and said that no way, that we will accept it only in the case that we will get something. And that was a kind of guarantee for universalism. And then it's very much about democracy and how democracy is implemented in different countries. But of course it has something to do with state capacity. Mm-hmm. Once again, in the Nordic countries, we used to have very strong states, central states, that could collect taxes and that could implement.
There's an
municipalities.
infrastructure.
Yes.
Yeah. Charles or Ari, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously... It's obviously
Maybe.
I don't know. Yeah,
Yeah.
that sounds better. Yeah, it's obviously a big question. I think I'd agree with Ari and Olli and everyone really that, you know, obviously what influences making these decisions is politics at a national level. It's political decisions. I guess what I'd say is what influences that is a changing in norms and understanding of issues of poverty across the life course, which in turn, you know, which has to happen amongst civil society organisations, amongst government, amongst international organisations. And my sense is that social pensions, where they're being implemented, are in a sense implemented in the context of a bit of a change in thinking about what is the role of the state in relation to poverty. And I think that the kind of key point that strikes me is for social pensions and more comprehensive social protection floors to be implemented, we need a change from the kind of standard perception of poverty that there are a kind of limited, relatively residual group of people within the population who are, you know, as they described in the late 19th century, the kind of social problem of the poor, to actually understanding that the poverty, vulnerability, insecurity are things that affect the vast majority of the population, and not only just influence this, you know, those poor people over there, but influence people's economic decisions. They influence how people interact within families, you know, the dignity of individuals within those families, and a wide range of very important areas for development, which affect all generations. I think it's with that and understanding the enormity of insecurities that people face, as Michael put it, that you start to actually see the need for policy change.
All right.
Many of the countries where I work, Vietnam, China, other East Asian countries, are not what we should call fully democratic, and that of course makes it very difficult, as we said before, for these marginalized groups to be heard. I think that gives governments with slightly different agendas a chance to disregard something that is necessary because they are looking at industrialization and they're looking at these other flashy projects and would rather put their money on a few Boeing or Airbus airplanes. I also think that we have a role to play here, we being, you know, researchers, civil society, donors and international organizations, because in particular in those societies, we are the stakeholders that can say something and that have the resources to be heard. I mean, in situations where domestic civil society is weak, international civil society has to take that role, and that pressure, I think, is important.
Thank you. Let's turn to you and see what questions you have for the panel or things that you want to share in this area. There's a question up there. We'll take those two questions and then we'll take a couple questions and then the panel will discuss. So please.
Well, my question is about the countries that were white on the map. Why are they still not using pension as a source for development? Is it lack of will? Is it lack of money? Is it lack of understanding? And what can we do as donors and partners to get them understand the value of the pension systems?
Thank you. So there was one more up there.
Just two observations and one quick point. It would seem to me that, in fact, I mean, I think the panel reflects this, that actually the motivation for pension can move from extreme right to actually very progressive. So let me take the example of the one about Vietnam. that what gets the attention of Vietnamese policymakers is that you can give farmers a low amount of money in pension, and they will give up their farms so that can be consolidated. I just want to understand this, because if that's the motivation for pension fund, I don't think we're talking about the same thing. I come from an agrarian, I grew up in an agrarian context. That's not the reason why people give up their farms. It's not simply, and especially in a situation where it's not about individual title. You actually do not have the right to dispose of a piece of land just because you are the one using it at the moment. That's one aspect. So it's important for me to understand that. The second one, and this is an argument that I've had repeatedly in the South African context. If I understand the Bolivian thing, the evidence of the success of old age pension is that there's an improvement in school enrollment. What has old age pension got to do with school enrollment? Those are grannies. What happened to the middle generation? Because I've had the same statistics, labor market search in the South African context. What has labor market search got to do with people who are already retired, and that's the reason why they are receiving old age pension? Isn't it in fact that what we are dealing with here is a very broken, social compact? And we may have a situation where it looks like a progressive international agenda, but it's actually being used to plug a massive failure, entitlement failure in the economy and in the labor market. So what happened to the parents? What happened to the middle generation?
Thank you. Well, let's start with the white spots on the map, Charles.
Why don't they? A range of issues. I mean, there's political issues. I guess some will relate more to specific debates around the pension system. There are some countries that are white on that map that may have relatively high coverage pension systems that are mainly contributory, and they don't see the need for a specific social pension. More broadly, I mean, it will vary hugely from country to country, but I think it's symptomatic of a lack of commitment to social protection more broadly, and the lack of a social pension or any other kind of meaningful pension system to provide income security in old age is part of that.
Yeah. Anyone else want to comment on that? Olli?
Actually, I have one question to Charles, because you spoke about the relationship between introduction of social pension and GDP per capita. Mm-hmm. And this is related to this question, what's the role of democracy? Have you done analysis if democracy plays a role or suffrage plays a role in introduction or in the initial phase of social pensions?
We've not done systematic analysis of that role, though there has been some research into that. That said, kind of anecdotally, but I think fairly kind of intuitively, we see very, very strong links between the introduction of social pensions and democratic processes. I mean, if you look at HelpAge's work over the past few years, and where our advocacy of HelpAge and its partners has actually impacted in policy, just a few examples. In Peru, that was around the election in 2011, and it was at that moment that of the pension becoming an election issue that it suddenly the kind of campaigning that had happened over years previously had an impact. Similarly, in countries like Thailand, Sri Lanka, Mauritius, I think political processes and democratic political processes create a lot more space for the introduction of social pensions. That said, I'm trying to think of some good examples now. There are countries that have introduced social pensions that are significantly less democratic. I mean, if we take the example of China, that's a clear case in point. I don't know if any other colleagues in the audience have have any other good evidence to hand. But yes, I think it plays a key role, but it's not a prerequisite, I'd say.
Ari, you want to address the question about Vietnam?
Yes,
And impacts. There was a
Yeah.
related question about Bolivia and the impact on, which
Yeah.
is related, I think.
I have great sympathy for the comment about land markets, and the reason I brought it up as an example of something that Vietnamese decision makers would respond to is that they really don't seem to have the priority, the political vision to carry this out for what I would perhaps consider as the right reason. And I may be a bit cynical, but I doubt whether the Chinese are doing their pension reforms for the right reasons either. When I talk to Chinese decision makers, what they highlight is how this is going to improve the function of the economy. And that is, of course, part of the story. We're talking about the relations between development and pensions, and there is a distinct link between those two. But what I started with perhaps is more related to the view of social pensions as a right rather than something that you introduce as a way of making the economy more efficient or productive.
The question on impacts then.
Yeah.
You showed that social pensions impact the whole household, school enrollments go up, and so on.
What I was trying to propose to you today is that in countries like Bolivia, where the household distribution is different, like from countries which are developed, like today I was talking with one person during lunch, and they were saying that here in Sweden, older people are actually independent and they live by themselves alone. But in countries like Bolivia, older people live with all relatives. Like I was saying that more than 80% are living with grandchildren, with sons-in-law, and that's why when we were doing the impact evaluation, we measured not only the success over the older population, but among all other individuals inside households. That's why if we are talking about development, that is, I mean, the development and the relationship with pensions, the social pension in Bolivia is not contributing only to development through the income security to older people, but it's also contributing to development on other indicators. That's why I was saying that we can see that the impact is not also in education and child labor reduction. And maybe it's not common to hear that conclusion, but it's something
It's an
new.
important one, right?
Yeah.
Because if social pension is the first building block in building a system of social protection, it reaches other goals besides
Yes.
providing old or retirement income.
Yes.
Olli, do you want to?
What I think was very fascinating with Joel's presentation on Bolivian case is that the pensions and the introduction of pensions, it helped also families and it helped children, yes. So that the children went to school and they were less and less involved in child labor. But on the other hand, we have been speaking very much about pensions here, but there's a kind of interaction between family policy and pensions, and that's a good example how pensions affected family policies, but on the other hand, good family policy is also precondition to good pension policy. And we have bad examples from some developing or developed countries that have been paying too much attention to development, and they have not, or as Ari said, that in China they are investing very heavily in economic growth. But on the other hand, they are neglecting family policies that leads to very unbalanced demographic structure. so that there's interaction between family policy and pensions and family policy.
Ari?
Just a question to Joel.
Yeah.
You have a lot of detailed data on how your pension scheme worked, but do you also know more specifically what the pensions were used for? Because that would provide a link, I think, at least to some extent, between the broader impacts, development impacts of the pensions and the just reduction of poverty as a narrower kind of concept.
Yes, from the total amount of the pension, in average, around 50% of the pension is going to food consumption, and we have like the rest that is used for payment of like electricity, water, and all and other services, and there is a small amounts that are used to like gift to other family members, and some small amount for savings.
But these were mainly the urban groups, or are there
No,
differences?
it's quite similar between urban and rural.
Just maybe to add to that, when people talk about cash transfers and including pensions, people talk a lot about an individual receives a cash transfer and then they share it with other people, and that would be the gifts that people receive, and people look at look at where that money can go to other people as well as the direct recipient. There's also another interesting kind of way of looking at it, which is the extent to which the individual who receives the benefit may receive less financial support from the family themselves. And there's some recent research in Mexico that found this. They actually found that older people who'd started receiving a pension received less income, slightly less income, from the family itself. Now, on one hand, in common kind of economic terms, that's talked about crowding out. The family's no longer supporting older people. Well, actually, they continue to support older people, just that income is slightly reduced. On the other hand, another way of looking at it is, in absence of income security for the older person, the family are having to take the full responsibility for the financial well-being of the older person. In presence of a pension, they can actually reprioritize that income elsewhere, in the sense they've reduced the amount they have to contribute to an older person, to their nutrition, to their health care, etc., etc. So it's interesting. It may not just be in the pensions coming in that's being shared. It may also be that the household need to give slightly less money to the older person, can prioritize it perhaps in other areas, perhaps in paying school fees and other areas. So I think, yeah, and going back to the point that was made in from the audience, I think it's very important not to think that social pensions are a magic bullet for other issues facing people across the life course. I also think it's important to remember that the primary impact of pensions is on older people themselves, though I think that's probably primarily on their kind of dignity and autonomy, and secondarily probably on the financial side. But I guess the reason we're talking a bit about the intergenerational and some of the kind of life course impacts of social pensions is that's one of the things that I think is often ignored. Current social protection pension policy says, older people, are they poor, are they not poor, should we give them a benefit? Well, maybe yes or not. But it forgets these complex dynamics between older people and younger generations, and also how looking to your old age and thinking, what am I going to do? I'm not going to have a pension. How that may affect your economic decisions, how that may affect reproductive decisions. Those are complex questions and they're very country specific, but I think it's important to look at questions of old age from that perspective and not just there's a group, are they poor, let's support them. I also think, maybe just to add to that, I think you can look at disability, you can look at the range of different kind of vulnerabilities, you can look at childhood from a similar perspective as well. But I all think they're actually quite distinct kinds of issues.
We have a couple more questions. I think it was back there and here. So let's take those questions.
Thank you. My name is Stephen Barrett. I manage the Ugandan government's basic social pension pilot program, which we hope to be scaling up nationally fairly shortly. The question I have is for the colleague from Bolivia. I was intrigued by your final bullet point where you were asking, is means testing the way to go for Bolivia in the future? And I wonder where that question is coming from. and who is asking that question in Bolivia? The reason I ask is I think that the answer to that may shed some light on why in Africa we saw those grey areas where there is no pensions in a lot of countries. And one of the reasons being, for example, in the Ugandan context, is if the targeting and means testing of pensions is the only option on the table, that's practically impossible to do in the Ugandan context, both politically impossible, institutionally impossible, and fiscally impossible as well in terms of the administration costs involved in doing it. So I wonder, I'm interested to know where that motivation is coming from in Bolivia, because I think it might shed some light on where, how the agenda is being shaped in that part of the world where we're yet to make progress.
One more there, and
Yeah, we've obviously been chatting, so we have complementary questions. But the question I have again is about Bolivia and the methodology that you've used, where people are around I think the age of 60, look at them just before and just after, where you get the increase in income, very impressive impacts, suggests that people aren't withdrawing from the labour market, right? The older people are getting the benefit and they're continuing the labour market, and therefore you have this increase in income. Isn't there a danger that if you decide to target the pension at the poor, you're going to create a whole set of perverse incentives where you only get the pension if you're poor, so therefore you're going to withdraw from the labour market to be able to access the pension, and therefore you're not going to get this overall increase in income, and therefore you're going to undermine the kind of benefits that you're seeing just because you're following a sort of ideological push towards targeting the poor, whereas it's the universal nature of the pension that is actually probably giving you those benefits, because there's no reason to withdraw from the labour market because you're not going to be punished by the withdrawal of your pension if you're continuing to work. And also, I think, to complement the question on the sort of white gaps, I mean, I think we have to realise that there's major ideological battles going on in the field of social security internationally, where in a lot of these countries there's a big push to target programs at the poor from international institutions, and that's the only sort of policy advice that governments are getting. And often it's programs which are very similar to the programs we had in the 19th century in Europe, targeting poor households in general. And that's what the kind of policy that's been promoted, often in democratic context. And as my colleague here was saying, that's not going to get any great political support, such as conditional cash transfers, workfare, etc. They're being promoted on the international agenda, and very few people are actually promoting pensions and universal pensions as a viable option in these countries.
let's try to keep the questions short. We're running out of time. I want everybody to...
Absolutely. I'm Erik Lusén. I'm also from Church of Sweden. You were talking about this strong correlation between sort of the introduction of social pensions in the countries and democratic political processes. And I have a question here specifically to Joel about the involvement of civil society organizations for pushing for social protection schemes in general and for pensions in particular, because I think Ari mentioned there's weak sort of domestic involvement of civil society organizations. So it would be good if we get another example from Bolivia. Have they been involved and to what extent?
Thank you. And one final one right here.
Yes, thank you. I'm Dag Ehrenpreis Price from Nordic Africa Institute and PRO Global Pensioners Without Borders. I wonder about the impact studies. We heard from Olli Kangas about sort of macroeconomic or at least infrastructure level impact of the pension funds. And we heard from the Bolivian studies about household level micro impact on consumption. But I wonder about the intermediate level, if there's any evidence of stimuli at the community level or regional level of the increased consumption resulting from the use of the pensions.
Thank you. Let's start with the question on targeting or means testing. Joel, you want to address that?
I put that bullet in the presentation because in Bolivia we have that situation where opposition in the government is always trying to put on the table that universal pension so far was good, but we need as a country to focus more on targeting poor people or poor households. So they are always with the same speech, and that's why I raised that point, because we don't know if it will work or not. So the results I presented today, there are showing that the program is successfully, but we don't know if targeting the poor will be more or less successful than we were doing so far. So that's why I think, in my opinion, that we need to do more, maybe more research on if targeting could work for Bolivia, but the recommendation is that maybe we are not ready for that, because we need to analyze also the costs of the programs in terms of efficiency, and that's why I wrote that point.
We'll have a chance to come back to that discussion tomorrow. There's a session on targeting and universalism.
Yeah.
But do you want to comment short on the civil societies and their involvement?
Yes, and civil society are, I mean, they are taking the pension as a good policy for them, but the involvement that they have in this policy is practically none or zero. There is no activity on their side to promote or to offer some improvements that they require as a community or as a rural area, but they are just receiving the pension in cash, and they are, let's say, happy with that. And we didn't. I work for the government, so we don't receive more comments additional than they want to increase the amount. And this year we actually increased the amount by a lump sum to all the older people, pensioners and not pensioners. So maybe we are trying to keep doing well with the universal scheme.
Okay. And finally, somebody want to say something about impact studies on the community level? Olli?
Yeah, macroeconomic impacts we spoke about, and Joachim Palme was referring to health impacts, so that the level of basic pension has some ramifications for health. But when it comes to regional levels, I would say that it's pretty easy to see, for example, in my own country, Finland, that in the 50s, for example, when people still were living in agrarian circumstances, the only persons in household that were getting money, they were the national pensioners and the children that were collecting child benefits. And then the household could collect that much money that a couple of boys or sons could move to Sweden to work in this country. And I'm coming from national pension, Kela institution that's paying out national pensions in my country. And we have calculated how much the different municipalities in Finland are dependent on our pensions, and municipalities were 80–90% of income that municipality, mostly in the northern part and eastern part of the country, are coming from national pensions. So that the only guys who are outside Kela, they are shopkeeper, then taxi driver, and perhaps undertaker. But all of them, they are using money that we are paying out to pensioners. So that there's a huge impact, I would say.
Did you want to say something finally?
I could just add to that at the kind of community level, I think there's a significant and growing body of evidence around both specifically social pensions and also other cash transfers showing the impact on on local communities in terms of businesses and their increased revenue, livelihood activities, etc., etc. In fact, I think a kind of word of advice would be to try not to, when thinking about cash transfers and pensions, not to get too centred on the idea of the household, because actually the reality of most people's lives in rural Bolivia or rural Zambia isn't that they live in their household and these are my kind of 3 household members and we do everything together, and there's the household next door that do something different. There's so much sharing communally within households that from my own kind of experience on the ground, what I've seen in Zambia where they've had a pension pilot, was immediately that benefit was very quickly seen amongst other members. So I think at the community level is perhaps the strongest, and the role of things like social pensions and other cash transfers in terms of redistribution between, 2 rural areas where, as Ari referenced, there isn't that much cash in the economy necessarily, I think can be really, really very transformative.
Thank you all. Thank you very much for an interesting discussion, and thank you to the audience for interesting questions. I think we've come to a close.
Thank you, Annika, and thank you all in the panel. I most certainly agree with you, and I think all of us do, that this was an extremely interesting debate to be continued tomorrow. And I'm sure that the energetic and enthusiastic, not to mention the very skilled and professional atmosphere in the room, contributes a lot to the result of the conference. So I will thank you, panel, and thank you, audience. But only the panel gets gold this time. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
This gets even more and more funny.
Thank you.
You are Charles. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. And Annika, here's a substantial lot for you too. Thank you very much. And I repeat this: the boat leaves at 5:45. And takes us all to the home of not only Pippi Longstocking, but all of the other creatures created by Astrid Lindgren. That is Junibacken at Djurgården. And we meet here tomorrow, and the session starts at 9 sharp. Almost 8:59, so please try to be on time. Thank you.